Head Charge. How you doing, Philly? Come on!
American Head Charge is certainly a name for a band, an industrial metal band specifically, founded all the way back in 1996. The band had a lot of members over the years, but the three that are going to come up a lot are Cameron Heacock, Justin Fowler, and Chad Hanks. For at least a few years, American Head Charge was a pretty big deal in the underground metal scene, and they did go mainstream for a while. They're sometimes called alternative or even new metal, but in my opinion they lean way more into industrial than anything else. They're loud, dark, and edgy. They were one of those bands. Very, very, very razor blade edgy. But the thing about American Head Charge is the reason they didn't last long is not because they were too edgy. Because in the early 2000s, that was, like, the thing. You think the emo kids were edgy? You fools! You know nothing of edgy. And I go around calling myself Darkness the Curse, and consider myself an expert in the field of being way too edgy for you. Believe me, American Head Charge is one of the bands that I loved as a teenager, and still do. They're the exact kind of music I'm very much into. I love dark industrial stuff, but because they leaned heavily into the dark side, it was a lot more of a reflection of what they were going through. Many of the band members suffered from a lot of demons, and those demons saw fit to make sure that their time in the limelight was relatively short-lived. They had issues. Lots of issues. And it means that their story is pretty interesting to talk about, and quite a bit sad in some cases. American Head Charge wasn't their first name. Some of their prototype names were things I actually can't say on YouTube without being demonetized, but eventually the one they really wanted to settle on was going to be Flux. A relatively inoffensive, yet still good name, but that was already in use by another band. Chad Hanks, one of the founding members, and played bass in the band for the entirety of its existence, later explained that he liked 3-word names, and at some point they settled on American Head Charge. When asked what the meaning was, he said, nothing. Literally. And that was the point. It didn't actually mean anything. It was just a name that was kind of catchy, that was attention-grabbing, but not to the point of being unfriendly to say on the radio, for example. Beyond that, it didn't mean anything, and that was the idea. They didn't want it to mean anything. The meaning was nothing. Emptiness. Darkness. Edgy. Anyway, some have suggested that it's actually a reference, though, to African Head Charge, which is a psychedelic dub ensemble. But Hanks would explain that no, that's just a coincidence. They didn't even know about African Head Charge when they came up with the name, so there was no influence there. The band would make their debut in the underground industrial metal scene in their founding city of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And to be honest, they were a pretty big deal at first. Prior to American Head Charge, Minneapolis, at least in terms of the underground scene, was still kinda stuck in the hair metal phase, more old school. AHC was more modern, leading into a lot of darker themes that would become synonymous with the early 2000s metal scene. The overall lineup of the band is a little chaotic and would change often, but as I explained, there's 3 names you want to keep in mind, and Heacock and Hanks would be in the band for the entirety of its existence, and Justin Fowler would join in the middle of the year 2000 to be their keyboardist, as well as their electronic mixer, because, like I said, they are industrial, or even industrial metal. If you don't know what that is, I would consider it, well, it's kind of like a mix of metal and techno. I generally just consider it edgy techno. It's a lot darker, but it has that electronic ring to it. That's kind of what they went with, though often they would lean into their guitars to be more like an alternative metal or new metal band, but regardless, they were themselves, and they always had a keyboard involved. They played at small venues throughout 1999 and did make a name for themselves locally in Minneapolis, but it wasn't until late 1999 when they had the chance to support System of a Down in Des Moines, Iowa. The bassist of System of a Down, Shavo Odagian, thought American Head Charge was frickin' awesome, and during a conversation with the founder of American Recordings, Rick Rubin, Odagian recommended that Rubin check out American Head Charge because he was in the search for new talent. 6 months after this conversation, American Head Charge would be offered a proper record deal with American Recordings. They'd already released their first album, independently, called Trepanation, in July of 1999. But under American, they would record their first studio album, which they called The War of Art. It would be released on August 28th of 2001. Now, Rubin himself is his own story, but he's worked with a lot of metal and rock bands over the years. He's considered a very good producer, and AHC recorded The War of Art at Houdini Mansion, sometimes just called The Mansion. It's a 4-bedroom home owned by Rubin, and a lot of very famous bands and acts have recorded some of their best works there. Red Hot Chili Peppers, Marilyn Manson, Guns N' Roses, Linkin Park, the list goes on. American Head Charge just happens to be one of the bands that was invited to record in this manner. And The War of Art did pretty well, all things considered. It sold 12,000 copies in its first week and went on to sell a little over 250,000, which, while isn't exactly a massive breakout hit, given their particular niche, that's pretty good. People into their type of music generally knew about American Head Charge and liked them. The first downside here was timing, and this wasn't anyone's fault except terrorists. What? What does 9/11 have to do with this? Well, the issue was, after the attacks, radio DJs, because back then people still listened to the radio for new music, were a lot more reluctant to play music with violent or dark themes. Because, you gotta see what the issue was here. And American Head Charge is very loud, very dark, and just didn't jive with the culture at the time. They tended to rail against society. This American society, the machine, the system. And, right after 9/11, everyone was very patriotic because we had just been attacked. Not that the band ever endorsed 9/11 or anything like that. They condemned it because, but they, and many other bands that were similar to them, suffered a decline in playtime as well as sales because of that horrible day. But the album was still considered a fair success, and they did go on tour, their first professional experience in this being at Ozzy Osbourne's 2001 Ozfest. They played third on the second stage for the whole thing, and were a crowd favorite. The one thing about American Head Charge is, regardless of what you think of their music necessarily, they know how to put on a show. These guys were great on stage. High energy, and just completely insane, to be perfectly honest. But that was part of what made it awesome. They were a fantastic band to jump in a mosh pit for. And after Ozfest, they got a slot on the Pledge of Allegiance festival tour that was headlined by Slipknot, No One, Mudvayne, Rammstein, and System of a Down. Though that particular tour would result in their first bit of major controversy. See, like I said, they're edgy and do crazy stuff on stage. Well, the guitarist, Dave Rogers, decided he would play their last show of the tour in New Jersey completely naked. Yup, they were allowed to finish the show, but he was arrested because, bro, come on now, but he wasn't jailed for particularly long. And in December of 2001, they supported Slayer for the first 2 months of the American God Hates Us All tour. Really? That's what they... These people. I told you. So edgy. They performed some following shows and then proceeded to have a 4-month tour over in Scandinavia, the UK, as well as Japan. But as I explained, surfing the dark side, especially embedding yourself in it, and writing music with those themes can suggest or lead to some fairly self-destructive behaviors. A lot of the members of the band had already struggled with drugs in the past, and after taking a couple years off, a lot of them took the money they made and just sunk it all into drugs. At least 3 members had become chemically dependent, and 2 of them were headed back to rehab. One of their guitarists, named Brian Otteson, sunk into a deep depression over the state of the band, and he almost checked into a mental institution because he was having thoughts of offing himself. But in order to get a better handle on their life, it was decided to channel all their efforts into writing and recording their next major album, which would eventually be titled The Feeding, and was released on February 15th, 2005. Originally, they were going to work with Rick Rubin again. He was a good producer and liked the band, but he had become, elusive. They couldn't find him. He often wasn't present for recording sessions and didn't return calls. And if you're wondering why, well, this is actually kind of classic Rubin. He does that. Often. Multiple bands have pointed it out. Corey Taylor of Slipknot pointed it out, because he did it to them, too. It's just something Rubin does on occasion. He just disappears. Whether it's out of laziness or something else, I can't really say, but it was such a problem in this case that American Head Charge asked to be let out of their contract so they could find a different producer. To his credit, Rick Rubin did let them out of the contract without any legal trouble. He gave them what they wanted with no arguments. So hey, that's something at least. They would move on, and in July of 2004, they signed a contract with DRT Entertainment, and The Feeding would wind up being produced by the engineer for The War of Art, Greg Feidelman. The big difference between The Feeding and The War of Art, I would say, is that it's a very streamlined album. You can tell that it's a much more professional sound. Some don't like that, they prefer the more garage band, loud noise from their earlier albums, but it's definitely the one that got the most radio play as a direct result. Partially because of their single, Loyalty, which is the song that let me find them in the first place. I first saw and heard Loyalty because the music video for it was playing at a media play I was frequenting in search of, believe it or not, Weird Al Yankovic CDs. But I saw them on the TV above where I was looking through the CDs and I'm like, holy crap, they sound awesome and edgy. Though, as good as the album was, at least according to Chad Hanks, apparently they never received any royalties for it. I'm not sure if there's a contract clause they miss with their new label, though I feel like they were probably taken advantage of here, and that's a real shame, because in my opinion, if you're interested in this kind of music and you can only listen to one album from AHC, make it The Feeding. It's probably their best work. The notion that they didn't make any royalties off this is frankly outrageous. But tragedy would continue to befall the band. They went on tour to promote the new album, but on April 19th, 2005, their guitarist, Brian Otteson, was found dead at the age of 27. Otteson was found in his bunk, presumably sleeping, which is why no one had thought to check on him until right before they were supposed to go on stage. See, according to the band, Otteson was a habitual heavy sleeper. They would go to bed at like 4 or 5 a.m., and it wasn't unusual for him to sleep all the way through the day until right before they were supposed to play. When they realized he wasn't breathing, of course they called the authorities, but it was too late to do anything. The death was ruled as an accidental prescription drug overdose. Though, to add to the tragedy, it probably wasn't anything to do with any kind of addiction or substance abuse issue. I mean, it was an overdose, but Otteson had been dealing with a bad case of strep throat for a while. He'd been prescribed penicillin and an unnamed pain medication to deal with it. He had had a bit to drink at around 4 a.m. the previous day, though Hanks insisted it wasn't anything super heavy. He said that all they had is 2 shots of vodka and a single beer each. Regardless of the exact reason, his death was a tragedy. He was a talented guy, and the band liked him. The members were understandably shaken, but they did carry forward. They would continue work for the next couple years until 2007. On April 3rd of that year, they would release their first DVD called Can't Stop the Machine through Nitrous Records. They supported its release with another tour, which ended on September 14th, 2007. After that, though, they really fell off hard. And not because they were necessarily unpopular. That last show in 2007 was sold out. But like I said, a lot of the members had issues. And they were starting to really struggle with them over time. Some of them would again have to enter rehab or quit the band entirely. The only one who was keeping fans informed of anything was Chad Hanks, as he had a personal blog, and would comment on the situation involving the band every so often. He was the one who confirmed that, yeah, drugs were kinda causing them a lot of problems, though he himself explained that he had been sober since the winter of 2007. So, hey, great for him. But their lead singer, Cameron Heacock, wasn't quite in the same mindset. He would enter rehab again in April of 2008. When Heacock got out, they did attempt to get back together and start recording for a new album. But problems came up involving Heacock. He's their lead singer, their vocalist. They kind of need him for a lot of things. But for the first week, when they attempted to record, Heacock was only there for 3 of the days. And his problem was kind of interesting. See, Heacock had written and sang and been in the band mostly blitzed out of his mind, which might explain a lot, honestly. But at this point, he was sober, which is great, but he was struggling to actually write anything. He didn't know how to write what he had before without the drugs, but he didn't want to go back to the drugs in order to write, because no, and that's completely reasonable, but he just couldn't access the creative side of his head again. He was supposed to spend some time hanging out with Hanks over in Minneapolis in order to reconnect with what had influenced them to write what the band was known for in the first place, familiar territory and all that, but he never showed up. And it's possible that this was also related to a sobriety issue. Often with addiction, one of the things that therapists don't want you to do is to go back to familiar territory, especially in places where you first started down the path of addiction. It's been known to cause people to relapse by being back in the same place where they first got hooked. I don't think Heacock was trying to avoid the band. I don't think it's that he didn't want to be in the band anymore. I don't believe that for a second. I think he was just trying to stay sober. And by August 11th of 2009, it was clear to most of the band members that it was just an impossible situation with Cameron. If he couldn't write or even be in the band without the drugs, and wasn't going to take the drugs because no one was going to tell him to do that because that would be horrible, then it was probably better to end things. They did briefly entertain the thought of replacing him with a new singer, and even received over 300 submissions for people who were auditioning for that role, but according to Hanks, most of them were just awful. He did say that though, he said they were horrible, quite literally, so it just wasn't something they were willing to do. They spent a little bit of time working with a couple different singers, one named Dennis Sanders Jr., who had played with Blacklight Burns, but he didn't work out because he wanted to focus on his solo material. He wasn't committed to American Head Charge. Josh Bradford also worked with them for a bit, but he didn't work out either. But eventually, Cameron Heacock would return, just out of the blue. He'd been no contact for nearly 2 years when Hanks finally heard from him, and he got back in touch by replying to one of the demos that Hanks had sent him 2.5 years before. Heacock recorded his vocals on top of the demo, and the following day, he received 2 more. Cameron was back, and on June 30th, 2011, Hanks was able to announce that the band planned on rehearsing again and making more music. And in October of that year, they embarked on a short tour, which would culminate in them recording an EP known as Shoot, the proceeds of which were meant to go to funding the next album. However, they didn't make quite as much money from the album as I think they wanted to. This was into the 2010s, when this type of overly edgy industrial stuff was a little less popular than it once had been. The market had moved on into probably more like metalcore, which is not really what American Head Charge ever was. Not that they were giving up. In March of 2014, they instead took to Indiegogo, because they still had a lot of fans, people still liked them, and they were hoping to raise funds to finance the recording of their 4th album. And they hit their target. They had a goal of $46,000 and raised $53,370. They offered a lot of really cool perks for supporting them on this. Downloads of their new songs, of course, pre-orders of the new album, signed gear, handwritten lyrics, VIP access to their shows, a name in the album credits, personal lessons from members of the band, a chance to perform with them, and to be on their guest list for life. One contributor even got a pretty unique perk, as he donated to get the band to play at their zombie-themed wedding reception. Yo, no, I'm not even upset, because that sounds so awesome. Following the success of this, riding the hype train, they started playing some shows alongside Wayne Static of the band Static X, performing at the Download Festival in June of 2014. Following a few more dates over in the United Kingdom, they went to Kentucky, to Third Sky Studios, to record the album that they had done the Indiegogo campaign for in the first place. Once they were finished with the recording, In October of 2014, they went on another tour over in Europe, and then returned to the States to rejoin Wayne Static, as well as Powerman 5000 for a multi-city US tour. But, sadly, tragedy would befall them again. Well, not American Head Charge directly, but they were there for it. Wayne Static, an absolute legend in the industrial metal scene, died on November 1st, 2014, while they were in Landers, California, just 3 days before he was going to turn 49. He had died in his sleep due to the effects of multiple prescription drug toxicity, involving oxycodone, hydromorphone, Xanax, and alcohol. Despite the tragedy, the other bands, including AHC, decided that they were going to continue the tour to honor Wayne, as according to pretty much anybody who knew him, he probably wouldn't want the music to stop on his account. American Head Charge shuffled back and forth between recording and touring over the next couple years, but eventually did follow through with the Indiegogo campaign and released their new album called Tango Umbrella on March 25th, 2016, via Napalm Records. To date, it is their last studio album. And just 4 months after it was released, Ted Hollows and Chris Emery quit without even consulting either Hanks or Heacock. They announced it on Facebook and just left. That would be a major complication for American Head Charge, but they could be replaced. But what really killed them off, truthfully, happened just the following year. On November 12th, 2017, bass player Chad Hanks, who has been one of the names that has come up the most during this entire story, and one of the major driving forces behind the continuation of American Head Charge, passed away at the age of 46. Not due to anything drug-related, though. In his case, he had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Based on sources, it doesn't seem like his family ever released exactly what he had, but regardless, it did wind up killing him. But many members of the band, former and then current, reunited all the way back in Minneapolis 2 weeks after his death for a benefit concert in his honor. Hanks' bass tech, Jordan Swanson, played the bass in his place. And that show also marked the very last performance of American Head Charge. Without Hanks, it didn't seem like there was anyone to keep the band grounded. Even Heacock couldn't do it because he was battling his own demons. A lot of the information I just gave you came from Justin Fowler, and he's also the one who's still somewhat involved in the music scene, though back in Minneapolis, underground. He says he's pretty happy doing that, though it is difficult for him to talk about the band just because of all the tragedies and trying issues that went along with American Head Charge. It's unlikely that they're ever to reunite now, though the vast majority of them have moved on in positive ways. Peter Harmon, who was their original drummer back in the late 90s, now works as a chiropractor. Yep. Good for him, though. Dave Rogers, the guitarist who I mentioned before, the one who played on stage naked and got arrested for that. Yeah. Well, he's really gotten himself together. He has a wife, kids, and a house. Pretty normal dude now. Go figure. Cameron Heacock, on the other hand, doesn't seem to have such a wholesome ending, so far anyway. He was arrested back in 2018 and was accused of driving a stolen van full of stolen items. This included over a dozen guitars and a motorbike. In the years prior, he'd also racked up multiple drug-related charges, and his last post on his Facebook page was back in 2019. Since then, there hasn't been a peep out of the guy. He's been radio silent, though no sources indicate he's in prison at the moment. He himself definitely had a lot of issues, and I don't think the death of his friend, Chad Hanks, helped those. Though for what it's worth, Cameron's a talented guy, and I hope he works through everything he's dealing with. Even if he never returns to music. To be honest, I don't expect it. As I explained, I don't think American Head Charge is ever gonna come back together again. For one thing, they were kind of a product of their time, and I'm not sure they'd ever have the same success that they once did. Plus, combined with the issues involved, it seems like it might only cause the band members more problems in the long term. I'd say it's probably better to let things lie. It sucks to say that, but they did some solid work over the years, recording some amazing tracks that are still listened to by me and many others even now. They put in their time, and it's okay if they want to move on from that, especially if it's better for their mental health. special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Road Videos, Lord Off 444, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Redline, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Josh Johnson, Caleb Brainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Zelinsky, JBL Explorers, Tommy Rossini, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mark Holding, Mr. Revel, Hayden DeGrow, Bad Train Puns Are Best, Kurt Forkham, Harry, Drew Debris, George Kenny, Kevin Wood, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Hannah Bird, Duraushi, A Person 723, William Nemo, Dr. Racer 78, Shima Sue, Metal for Life Guy, Andrew Bowen, Crimson Rose, Ryan Wehofer, Zintac M, Boss K, Andy, The Conceptualist, Ohio Trucker 1, Windy City Rails, John Videola, AET Museum, Extra Special J, Kieran Tibbetts, DFL Church, Murder Drones Doll, Bob Kondirk, Your Mom Liked It, Jared Brussel, Caden Alvey, Levi Anderson, Darrell Williams, Liam Wright, DE Ultra, Mr. Sleepy, NJ1969, Acoletti, Jonathan Coco, John, Connor Hahn, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness of the Bitch World of Fun. Farewell.